Hehe, just kidding. Okay, so first match. Kawa's ship, the VIP3, versus my ship, the Eidolon. So, Kawa's ship, as was discussed in the last video, I think, was this orbital wall, and normally there's asteroids that cause it issues, but due to circumstances I don't recall, they are not present in this match, so my ship is arguably in a worse position. Because mine, the fast wall, or avoider as some people refer to it, is all about being agile and hiding behind rocks, but there's no rocks to hide behind. So I have to try and do my best to maintain the space advantage, otherwise Kawa will just into my ship because he has cannons and more damage and is just typically scarier. And these rotations that he's doing, if he can catch the edge of my ship on his, then it will make it so I'm stuck, and then he instantly wins. So I have to make it so that if he's going at wide enough angle, I have to rotate accordingly so that I don't have issues. And so now Kawa is split, and with a weaker pilot that would be a great thing, because the other ship has no chances of coming to help. Unfortunately, Kawa is a decent pilot and will sometimes bring the other ship to help, which, as you can see, I'm very occupied dealing with the front half of this one, and I'm trying to push it out of the way so I can get back into the ring and not have any more issues. And I've done a significant amount of damage. At least a third of Kawa's health is now gone, and the other one still has not moved, you can see from the minimap, as I continue to finish off the other one, and I think Kawa forfeits here. I'm Zeros, by the way, in case it wasn't clear, and, you know, I'm fighting in all of these, or I was fighting. The Eidolon is my ship, and I'm facing Gustav's, and I didn't read the name fast enough, so you will have to read the subtitles. And Gustav is one of the fathers of this type of ship class, this ship piloting, as am I. He introduced me to it, and we were both working on it as it developed and such. So we're two of the most practiced players in this matchup of fast walls. His ship has strafe. He always preferred strafe, and he still does. And his ship is going to be strafing a lot more than mine. Like, strafing is a very important part of these ships because it allows you to go faster and destabilize opponents, but his more heavily invests in strafe. He can strafe back and forth a lot more effectively at the cost of not being able to push back and forth, or go back forward and backwards as effectively as mine. So fights between these ships are a bit of a dance, more so than other ships, though those can still be elegant and graceful and such, because you want to be spreading damage across your shields, and your opponent does the same, and you can both disengage at any time, which is somewhat rare. Like, a lot of ship types just have all forward thrust and cannot disengage if they get close enough. So it's about trying to maneuver such that your opponents will be running into your shots and such. So he, noticing that I targeted his left flank, rotated to the right, which makes it so that my shots were not landing, or if they were landing, they were not focused and were not piercing shields as effectively. And it's worth noting that you always want to be tilted in these fights, because it allows your weapons to be a little bit better focused and your shields to be a little bit more dense. Which is why I'm rarely, why we're both rarely just facing head on against the other. So now the rock asteroid will come in and give us both a opportunity to seek a reprieve, and Gustav takes it, as well as I do. We both back off to let shields recharge. Now you might be wondering, why are the weapons auto-firing? And lasers don't fire preemptively. I don't think any weapons do. So, or they don't pre-fire preemptively optimally. So these ships auto-fire because if both opponents are moving towards each other, then the momentum of the lasers themselves, as well as your opponent moving into range, will make it so that the lasers technically have better range, but are just firing accurately. And these ships are typically optimized or tuned that they can auto-fire at all times. My ship can auto-fire all of its weapons and never really have an issue. Like, if its shields are stressed, then it would probably have an issue. So since we were trading blows earlier, and Gustav got the worst of it, he is trying to play defensively. So knowing this, I'm boxing him out and forcing him to go into the rod, or the ring of death. which he will take slow damage over time that progressively lowers all of his block's health. So he doesn't want to be there. He'll die eventually if he goes out there. So it's either deal with me or deal with the rod, and the rod will 100% kill him. So it's worth noting that I probably should have stopped auto-firing so that my weapons were synchronized again. Even though this burst or sustained fire is more effective at dealing damage, the burst fire, though less consistent, is better at piercing shields, and these are ships with like more than 20 for sure. I think mine has 32 shields on it. So burst fire, or stopping the auto fire so that all the cooldowns are lined up, is often superior. So we've both traded blows, but he has gotten the worst of it, so he has to try and figure out how to play defensively and evasively more so. And I want to be forcing him to fight and be close, because if we just trade out like the rest of our blocks, it will make it so that he is in a significantly worse position. Because 1 for 1, I have more health. You can even look at the top health bar. And his reactors are very exposed, and I think he only has 1 control room behind that 1 reactor, and yeah, I got it. Now for the third match, and it is my Scion of Glory, which is a red nuke ship, versus Rose's deck cannon ship, which primarily uses armor. And there is a fight in the background between the missile ship and those rail traps, but we want to focus on the nuke ship versus the deck cannon rammer, which are what those are typically called. So deck cannons are very interesting because they have awful projectile stats besides damage, so they just can't hit things. And ships like mine can very easily avoid them. So deck cannon rammers are about imparting as much speed as you can onto the deck cannons and forcing your opponents to get hit by them because they can't stay out of the way. Unfortunately, this is kind of a matchup for me, or that is geared towards me winning, but I think Rose was convinced that the armor would be enough to tank all the nukes. And the funny thing about nukes is they can't really be tanked. You're not going to tank nukes. Nukes are not for tanking. And when I go sideways like that, is so that I can line all the nukes up to go in one piercing volley. And as you can see, it very nearly took out Rose's internals. I think it took out a deck cannon. So despite all that armor, it just shredded its way through. Which is part of the reason I love piloting that ship. And I have a side armament of several small lasers. And there's another volley, and as you can see, I tilted my ship to line it up again, and it went into the same gap and destroyed more deck cannons. So Rose, knowing that time was running out, switched to blew off the armor for higher speed, because clearly the armor wasn't helping, it wasn't fast enough, and because of that the deck cannons can no longer fire over it. And the small lasers can now target the reactor, and that's part of what they're for. The small lasers have no delay on firing, which is an issue that the nukes have. So they should be able to get the reactor there, pretty sure. Because, you know, that's what they're for, and it can be very easy to dodge nukes if you're fast enough, but it is significantly harder to dodge small laser shots. So Rose lost their reactors. Now they're on a limited time, because eventually their thrusters will run out of energy, or even their control rooms if Rose stops moving to conserve thruster energy, and has to try and force both of these ships to get around me, get behind me, and it's not really working because I know this and can just stay out of range. In fact, I'm not using any more nukes because my ship only has 6 or 7 volleys, I'm not sure, and doesn't want to waste ammo when I can just use the small lasers. So a thing about these elimination lobbies is that if there's 4 players, it's like a mini tournament, and as you can see from the top health bars, Crispy Bacon won against his opponent. So his ugly trap, which is a pair of rail traps, is versus my Scion of Glory, which was why I was conserving ammo. I want to be able to take down a second opponent. And this one is a lot more interesting, I think, because I know it's not just going to be cut and dry like the last match was. So the ugly traps, Crispy Bacon wants to be firing from both sides. My ship is very vulnerable from the rear, and if he can get around me, I will be having problems. So here I'm trying to be cute, trying to be a little bit clever, and I'm using part of Rose's corpse as a shield, as one really should incorporate. But I'm noticing that Crispy Bacon did not effectively space his ships, so even though that one just fired and I took some pretty sizable damage, the other one is too far away to help. So if I can quickly kill this one, then it becomes a much better arrangement, because he only has one ship versus mine, and my ship is twice as expensive as a given one of these. So, as was mentioned in the last video, I think traps are kind of difficult to pilot, especially these slow ones. So now I'm trying to maneuver such that his will body block his other trap, and he is, auto-firing he's moving his thrusters to try and prevent that. And I very nearly bit it because he could have fired at my thrusters there. And he destroyed 2 reactors in one shot, very impressive shot. So now it's getting a lot closer. He lost the other trap, but I am eventually going to run out of ammo. Rails are very ammo efficient, so that's not a concern for him. And nukes when fired at close range will damage the launchers they were launched from, so that was a mistake. I should not have fired there. And that was good shots. He over-rotated, and as you can see, he doesn't have very many thrusters as opposed to mine. But then I'm continuing to have problems, and I auto-fired or fired nukes when I shouldn't have. So even though he has no thrusters, I'm running very much out of weapons. And I lose more launchers over there. It was very stressful trying to manage this. But now that there's this rock, I don't have to take care of pinning him in place. I can safely maneuver to use my one nuke. Since my laser blasters, the reactors that power them are out, so I couldn't use those. So I have the one nuke, and there we go. I launched it successfully. Okay, so 4th, or maybe 5th match, depending on how you order it. And it's Salif's the Kababababob, or whatever that is, versus my pair of laser traps, the Spider Dance. Glorious ship. Love it. Love both of these ships. Great ships. And Salif's is using a TB railfan. And TB rails, tractor beams, of course, are about tilting your opponent's ship, because most ships have enough armor to survive a railfan volley, but no ships can survive a railfan volley from the side. No one thinks to put armor there. So these tractor beams are ideally used to tilt my ships, except I have very high thruster amounts, so I can out-rotate the tractor beams, especially if I turn boost on, and I want to always have one behind him firing at the thrusters. And Salif's is trying his best to get out of this, rotate his ship so that there's minimized amounts of that, and he's destabilizing the traps with the tractor beams to ideally tilt them so that there's not armor and shields in the way, and so that they aren't as close to him. And it's very difficult for him, for both of us. This is a very intense match that can always go either way. And these ships really ought to have cannons, because clearly the lasers, despite spending so much time behind him, did basically nothing. So this is kind of a bad arrangement for me, because now it's essentially a 2v1 if you think about it, just in terms of price. So now I have to figure out how to try and get behind him and just effectively kill him. And the only saving grace of this is that he has lost a ton of thrusters and can no longer move nearly as effectively, and doesn't have a tractor beam online as well. That's really bad. I should not have been that tilted. So I have armor in front of my reactor, and I always want him to be hitting that, because if he takes out shields, I get diminishing health, and shields recharge. And I was giving up at this point, trying to get around him. So I changed tactics, and I start firing at his rails at some point, because I do recall this match. It's a lovely match. And it's kind of scary. So I think that Salif's ship's rails, the rails got misaligned. So instead of firing all 4 rounds, they start firing only 2 or only 3. Which, when you're facing shields that recharge, is a kind of huge issue. See, there's only 1 there, and there's only 2 there. So once you start having your rails misaligned, you can continue firing like as much as possible and technically getting more damage, but it can be superior to pause your firing so that you can start firing all of them at once. And I probably would have lost this match. See, that's only another 3. And as I'm firing at him, my electrobolters are often turning the railgun launchers, the very tips of them, off because they're hitting them, and I'm stressing his energy system beyond belief because his tractor beams keep having to push me away, his thrusters keep having to account for me, I'm shutting down his shields, and his rails are being depowered, so he might be having energy issues despite the 3 large reactors, and I took out a engine room, which means those thrusters no longer have power and have 50% less thrust, so I took out more thrusters. And they'll run out of power eventually. But I am clearly running out of weapons. I lost more, I might have lost a shield, and despite me being at less than half of my firepower, Salus still has all of his firepower. I definitely lost a shield there. Very bad. But he lost a rail, so it's getting closer. It's coming down to the wire, really. And he pushes me away and I'm tilting again and he can't capitalize. I think the tractor beams are also kind of assisting me in that aspect because they impart the same amount of force, which normally isn't an issue, but clearly he has lost thrusters. And his armor has been so degraded that I can very directly fire on the rails now, so he's tilting to try and use his corner armor accordingly. I take both of those shots on my armor, and that's direct fire on the rail, and it's becoming a lot more desperate. This is not typically how this goes, because normally the rails can penetrate the shields and stuff, and if he gets a clean shot at an angle, I instantly die, which is what happened to the other ship. But because I am using only one of these, I can directly control it. Now traps, since there's 2 of them, you can't directly control. Direct control only works for 1. So for traps you have to use RTS mechanics, which means your piloting is worse. But with only one of these, I can better account for thrust changes and Salif forfeits. Okay, so 5th and last match. It's Salif's ship, the hippity hoppity or lemon juice is my probably property, versus my ship that was a work in progress, because it has no paint clearly, the Impression of Intention, which is a pair of deck cannon traps. So the laser traps, the laser wall traps with disruptors, were clearly not doing the job. Despite how much ever time I spent behind Salif's ship, it didn't do anything. But deck cannons have one of the largest damage numbers in the game. It's just that they have issue hitting stuff, but you can't dodge if you're being attacked from 2 angles. So that's what their shtick is. Get behind an opponent and use the huge amount of damage, because each of these has 4 deck cannons each, and it's versus a rail kite. So I need to manage to get behind his ship and box it in without letting it kite away. Like, I didn't come at the right angle here, and I was firing at the reactors, so they weren't firing correctly because they hit the large shields. And because Salif has managed to properly orient his ship and get out of that, I need to start evading. Especially since the top ship had its control rooms EMP'd, so it can no longer move. And I'm incredibly lucky that Salif didn't capitalize, and now I'm using the other ship to body block. And it turned back on just in time. And Salif can no longer fire me because I'm hiding behind the rock, so now I narrowly avoided death and can continue to prevail, or survive. And now Salif is in a worse position because he is stuck near the rod, and a rail kite, which is a kite that uses rails, always wants to have range to kite away because, you know, that's the shtick. And if you're right up next to the rod like he is, then there's issues. So focusing on the other one, he didn't see the other one, and his thrusters have to ramp up still. And because he's so close to the rod, he has to try and finagle around it. And the other ship manages to get a shot in, which reduces the thrust a little bit, makes it so that it'll eventually cut off. And he over-rotates, so now the other one gets its EMP missiles blown up, which actually causes the EMP effect, and it took out the shields. And the other one is having its shields destroyed. Like, each of these has like 18 shields, I think. and they have, yeah, they depend on the shields for durability. These ships were built to take on rails, and shields are great against rails. So I activated the boost to try and get behind that one. Since the other one can't help anymore, I sent it back to the ring so it wasn't melting, and I tried to box that one out, and clearly I got it, because the few deck cannon shots made it to the reactors, and Salif has no weapons, and I win. Ta-da!